Hello! Today I'm taking a look at a fleeting, albeit interesting character encountered in Final Fantasy VII, and a significant contribution to the story arc of Barret Wallace. The character of Dyne is a turning point in the game story that chips away at our preconceptions of Barret's character, and marks a harrowing moment where we witness a previously well-intentioned moral man reduced to nothing but a nihilistic shell of himself. Now, I've previously mentioned grey characters within the Final Fantasy series, by which I mean anti-heroes and anti-villains such as Cypher, Ravus, Jecht and Kuja, and these are an intriguing subset of characters because they operate in this murky realm between good and bad, and I'd say Dyne sits comfortably among these character types. The great appeal of them, and the great tragedy of them, is that they're not inherently evil characters, driven by the maniacal need to dominate or destroy, like conventional antagonists, but rather, in almost every instance, they have embraced the worst aspects of themselves and been driven to do bad things by traumatic external events that have happened to them. Dyne is perhaps the briefest and most poignant example of this, because he's wholly unsalvageable. All hope has been driven from him, which culminates abruptly with his suicide, which I think is the first, and to this day one of the very few suicides that I've actually witnessed in a game story, and it was quite an uncommon thing at this time, particularly in a Japanese RPG, to see a character, end on such a melancholic and depressing note. So I feel Dyne warrants discussion because of this tragical aspect of his character and the subsequent appeal that it's fostered for him. Many fans have stated that they wish he'd been included more in the game, which I also stated about him in my original Final Fantasy VII review, and there is some chatter and discussion emerging about his inclusion in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and whether this will extend beyond a short boss fight to some playable flashback sequences, or extended exposition on Barret's backstory, which will include him, and of course this remains to be seen. So let's delve into the fleeting appearance of Dyne, and what this does for the game, and how subsequent events unfold. And first off, it's a really interesting narrative device for how we perceive Barret, because up to this point he's been something of a shouty, indignant, one-dimensional character who hates the Shinra and loves his daughter. Most of his dialogue revolves around wanting to save the planet, but upon our discovery of Dyne's existence, we finally understand why Barret acts the way he does, and what lies beyond this surface-level angry demeanour, which, as we discover, is quite a poignant guilt about what happened to his town, his friend, and their families, which is really interesting, and it's a great, plot twist, if you like, because it's a completely left-field angle, and it throws Barret into this new, unforeseen direction, because he's the last character that you would expect to harbour, dark secrets, which is ultimately the case, and in this instance, they come back to haunt him. The build-up to this revelation is expertly done, because, recalling the game events, we're in the Gold Saucer, and suddenly people start turning up dead, with witnesses reporting the perpetrator being a man with a gun arm. This is somewhat perturbing, because Barret has a gun arm, of course, and he's got a fiery attitude, but at the same time he's the last person you would expect to commit indiscriminate murders at a theme park. Shortly after being thrown into the desert prison, the reveal comes as he explains his backstory, and this is our first impression of Dyne and our first retrospective glimpse of him. And in the flashbacks he's a practical, friendly, and seemingly all-round good guy, and indeed the moment we see Corel in flames in the flashback, Barret is thrown into a rage, and it's Dyne that holds him back and maintains this measured approach to things and puts family first, rather than revenge. We then see the cutscene of Scarlet sadistically directing her squad to shoot at Barret and Dyne's hands, while Barret attempts to save Dyne from falling into the ravine, and with Dyne plummeting to his presumed death, we return to the present day. And this is the moment that Barret states that, another man had the operation for the gun arm, and he's always, assumed this to have been Dyne. So this reveal and flashback is a great set piece for the events that follow, because at this point in time, Dyne is an unknown quantity, and the player is left thinking, are we going to have a happy reunion? Are we going to unlock a potentially new party member? The first playthrough of the story permits these excitable possibilities to run through our minds, tempered only by the knowledge that Dyne has committed murders in the Gold Saucer. So we have this kind of sense of foreshadowing that clearly something is amiss here. This leads us on to the reunion with Dyne and the subsequent boss fight. And for me, this was a moving part of the game, because we have Barret initially happy to find his friend again, but swiftly he comes to realise that Dyne is a shadow of his former self, and the man in the flashbacks is long since dead. And there's this tense desperation to this scene, with Dyne goading Barret into a fight, to the point that battle ensues. Now, in my Final Fantasy VII discourse, I mentioned elements of existentialism employed in the game, whether through character perspectives or story, and it's known that JRPGs throughout the 1990s did enjoy exploring 19th and 20th century existential thought, with perhaps the starkest example being Square's 1998 game Xenogears. But turning to Dyne, he wholly embodies a worldview closely bound to the ideas of existentialism, which is an existential nihilism. Now, existentialism is commonly defined by Friedrich Nietzsche's infamous proclamation that God is dead and we have killed him, which, rather than being as dramatic as it sounds, essentially means that civilization has shifted to a new paradigm of self-determinism, and people have freedom to dictate individual choice, meaning and purpose in life, rather than relying on the theistic scriptures and the church, which had governed societies for centuries, up to this point. Now, while existentialism is meant to cause angst, followed by an eventual acceptance and liberation through acknowledging, the ultimate personal freedom, nihilism is a more defeatist offshoot of this, where failure to find a raison d'etre renders life meaningless, and the individual fails to observe a point or purpose to existence, in turn failing to observe social norms and constructs that govern society, such as laws, morals, rules, or religion. Looking at Dyne, the aforementioned traits of nihilism are palpable in his character, from his indiscriminate killings in the Gold Saucer to his indifference at seeing Barret again after so many years, and his defeatist response to discovering Marlene, his biological daughter, is still alive. Now, clearly Dyne suffered badly at the hands of Shinra, and one can empathise to some extent at his subsequent worldview, but his failure to count his blessings and see the silver lining that Marlene's still alive, Barret's still alive, or even that he himself managed to survive, shows how totally the idea of existential meaninglessness has inched into him. And because the player has observed his backstory and sympathises with him, it's a great game moment because we desperately want him to see the bright side here, and at the very least reconcile with his long-lost friend. But it's not the case, and quite to the contrary, Dyne's nihilistic philosophy rationalises absurdities such as, Marlene having to die, which he believes would be a logical course of action. And as he states right before the fight with Barret, right after the fight with Barret, his hands are too bloodstained to kind of hold her anymore anyway. So it's this moment where he's just completely given up on everything. So the Dyne segment is poignant because rather than reconciliation, assistance or understanding, he opts to abruptly kill himself rather than acknowledge a renewed reason for being. And although he's not a central character, in some ways we could consider the impact of his death on a par with Aeris, because it conveys a profound sense of loss and lost opportunity, and it resonates profoundly with the party, and in particular the character of Barret, who now, rather than an almost comical, shouty, angry character, is seen to be a man harbouring a weighty guilt about the past that is never resolved, and indeed is made somewhat worse by seeing Dyne again. Now, a final note on Dyne is the environment he inhabits, because it adds to this sense of personal purgatory he finds himself in. Unable to let go of the past and tormented by his hatred of the Shinra and his guilt for his absence during the destruction of Corel, Dyne's environment in the desert prison resembles something out of Dante's Inferno, where he perpetually relives these regrets, quite literally on the edge of an abyss, which reflects his worldview, I think. And it's prudent to note the 2 makeshift grave markers that are situated on the cliff precipice, which I always used to think were arbitrary graves to add some sort of morbid decoration to the desert prison. But in retrospect, I think they are clearly memorials Dyne has erected for Marlene and Eleanor, respectively, signified by one being small and child-sized, and the other being larger to signify, an adult, his wife Eleanor. And these are interesting aesthetic inclusions to the environment because, once again, it shows Dyne's constant reliving and self-reminder of these events, with the graves serving as tangible symbolic markers to maintain this self-purgatory that he's made for himself, which is something further exemplified by Eleanor's gold pendant that he also wears around his neck as well. So, being such a fleeting inclusion to the game, that about wraps up my thoughts on Dyne, but he's an interesting character and forms a powerful moment of game story that articulates Barret's tormented past and lack of redemption and self-forgiveness, which is actually something we rarely see in JRPGs because they usually enjoy the power of friendship conventions where characters are given, a renewed sense of purpose and second chances and things like this. As I stated previously, it's the first in-game suicide I remember witnessing, all the more poignant because it's not a self-sacrifice to save someone or, defeating an enemy, but rather it's a genuine despairing suicide, someone that's given up on life, which is the antithesis of what most JRPGs generally strive towards. So, what are your thoughts on Dyne? Is he an interesting element of game story, or merely an obstacle to overcome? Would you like to see his role expanded in the remake, or is he fine as he is? Drop a comment, start a conversation, and as always, if you enjoyed the episode, please share and subscribe to help my channel grow.